Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the healthcare lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has more than 40 years' experience serving clients in the healthcare industry nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we'll look at some of the regulatory and enforcement trends we've been seeing recently in the dietary supplement space, and we'll consider ways the landscape may or may not shift in the future. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Bonnie Odom. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our Los Angeles office. 2020 was a record year for growth in the dietary supplement industry. According to a Nutrition Business Journal estimate, U.S. supplement sales grew more than 14% in 2020, an increase of $7 billion in a single year. For comparison, in the prior 5 years, supplement sales had grown about $2 to $2.5 billion per year. Sales for supplements geared towards cold, flu, and immunity saw the largest leap, which is no surprise given the COVID-19 pandemic. But sales of supplements focused on other conditions also saw significant gains, such as supplements for sleep support and mental health. And it's expected that elevated consumer interest in supplements will continue even post-pandemic. With this heightened consumer interest and many new entrants to the market, important questions have emerged about the adequacy of the current regulatory framework for dietary supplements. Are current controls adequately protecting consumers from supplement products that are unsafe? Is enough being done to curb supplement companies' use of illegal drug claims, which can mislead consumers and cause them to believe that supplements are safe and effective for the prevention or treatment of disease? What is the right level of regulation for these products? On today's show, we're going to explore these questions in the context of recent regulatory and enforcement trends in the dietary supplement space. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we welcome to the show Jack Wenik and Delia Deschaine. Jack is a former assistant U.S. attorney and a member of the firm in our healthcare and life sciences practice. He has over 25 years of trial experience using scientifically driven defense strategies before the DOJ, FDA, and FTC. He guides dietary supplement companies and a wide range of healthcare providers in class action litigation and commercial litigation disputes. Delia is a former attorney advisor for the DEA and a member of the firm in our healthcare and life sciences practice. She has over a decade of experience in advising pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, and biotechnology clients on a broad range of FDA and DEA regulatory matters, including development and approval, compliance, risk evaluation, and also defending clients in government investigations and litigation. Welcome, and thanks for joining us, Jack and Delia.
Thanks for having us, Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie.
All right, let's start by looking at the current regulatory framework for dietary supplements in the US. I think there's some general confusion among consumers about the FDA regulatory framework for supplements and how different it is from the FDA's regulatory framework for drugs. From an FDA perspective, dietary supplements are regulated under the general umbrella of foods, and they're subject to the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, DSHEA or DSHEA, you might hear it pronounced. Delia, can you tell us at a high level what DSHEA does and doesn't do?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Bonnie. So first, as you pointed out, I think it's important to consider the differences that exist from a legal perspective between drugs and dietary supplements. So under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, drugs are defined as products that are intended to treat, mitigate, prevent, diagnose, or cure a disease or condition in man or other animals. And drugs, as a general matter, must be pre-approved by FDA before they are introduced into interstate commerce. There are different approval pathways for drugs. As a general matter, they include the filing of a new drug application, which can be very costly, time-consuming, and the likelihood of success can be difficult to predict. Another pathway is to approval for a drug pursuant to the OTC monograph amendment process, which is a process that Congress actually recently revamped to reduce some of the inefficiencies that have historically existed. But regardless of the pathway to market, with limited exception, all drugs must be pre-approved by FDA, as I mentioned before. Dietary supplements, in contrast, which may be lawfully marketed under DSHEA, are not subject to the same FDA pre-approval process. And I think some people actually don't know that and assume that they are. And the real fundamental difference between drugs and dietary supplements are the claims that the company lawfully makes about these products. It's unlawful under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for a company to make drug claims about a dietary supplement. However, there are permissible claims that a company can make about a dietary supplement that are more than just claims about the product's potential nutritive value. So under DSHEA, companies that market dietary supplements are not required to seek pre-approval by FDA, but they cannot introduce products that are adulterated into interstate commerce. So in other words, it's the company's responsibility to ensure that the dietary supplements that it markets are safe. DSHEA also authorized FDA to promulgate regulations requiring dietary supplement manufacturers to make their products in compliance with current good manufacturing practices, also known as CGMPs. These standards had already existed for drugs for years before DSHEA was enacted and were aimed at ensuring that dietary supplement products were made consistent with a high quality standard. FDA promulgated regulations governing CGMPs in 2007, and over time has increased its enforcement of those requirements and scrutiny over dietary supplement manufacturers in general to ensure that they're adhering to those standards. Those standards are codified in regulation in 21 CFR Part 111, and FDA has also issued a number of small entity compliance guides to help businesses comply with the new standards.
Thank you, Delia. It sounds like DSHEA definitely puts in some standards, but there are also clear limits. And given the rapidly expanding and evolving dietary supplement industry, there has been increased stakeholder discussion around modernizing the law. For example, one proposal that has been discussed would require all supplement companies to list their products in a federal database. So this would give FDA oversight, at least of the products on the market. Jack, do you think this or other changes to the law would add material public health protection? What are some of the arguments for and against strengthening FDA's regulatory authority over supplements?
Thank you, Bonnie. So this is an interesting question, an interesting topic. I think as a general rule, all regulators want to expand their authority. You never hear somebody jumping up and down and saying, please curtail what we are able to do. But when we're talking about dietary supplements, DSHEA was enacted in 1994 in reaction to what I could best describe as the overreach of the FDA. Regulators were unilaterally declaring things that had been marketed for many years and are in the food supply as an unapproved food additive and trying to shoehorn dietary supplements into that pre-approval process that Delia described. And so if we look at dietary supplements as foods, which they're regulated as foods, there are certainly many tools that the FDA already has in its arsenal to address any sort of dietary supplement product that's quote unquote unsafe. As Delia mentioned, there are good manufacturing standards that are applied to dietary supplement makers now. The FDA could order recalls of products that are in some way a danger. You could even have criminal prosecutions for violating these standards. I certainly don't believe, and I think most people in the industry don't believe, that we need a whole new wave of regulations. It's just not feasible, for example, to have a master list of all the products. There are tens of thousands of products and new products coming on the market every day. And while for sure there are some unscrupulous players in this space that say bad things or make their products in a, haphazard manner, the reality is, in my anecdotal experience, that most dietary supplement products are safe. And in fact, if you look at the medical literature, there's been a number of studies about emergency room visits and what have you. And the records for OTCs, like take aspirin, for example, produces many, many, many more emergency room visits than any dietary supplement. Same for acetaminophen and a lot of other things that people will go to any Walgreens or CVS or what have you to buy. I don't see any sort of crisis that we need more regulation of dietary supplements. I think the whole point of DSHEA was to encourage innovation, encourage access to products, encourage access to information by consumers. And I think most dietary supplements have a pretty good track record. And so we shouldn't be doing things or be swayed because there are a handful of bad actors out there that may give the industry a little bit of a black eye every now and then.
And along with FDA's authority under DSHEA, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, also has authority in protecting consumers against false and misleading claims about the safety and benefits of dietary supplements. Back in the early 1970s, the FDA and FTC entered into a memorandum of understanding that sought to establish how the two agencies would work together to regulate supplements. And that memorandum of understanding gave FTC primary responsibility with regard to supplement advertising and gave FDA primary responsibility for supplement labeling. And of note, the term labeling has been interpreted very broadly by FDA to include the label on the actual product container, as well as any material accompanying the product, from brochures to pamphlets to websites. It's a very broad term. And in practice, the two agencies work together very closely, and in some cases have initiated coordinated enforcement efforts, which we'll get to more in a moment. But first, Delia, can you review for us the key standards that FTC is looking for supplement claims to meet?
Sure. So there's a basic requirement that dietary supplement marketing must be adequately substantiated, and it also must be truthful and not misleading. So the substantiation standard is very nuanced and it's very fact specific, and it really depends a lot on the claim that the company intends to make. And while the FTC has issued guidance, both through its enforcement actions and otherwise, that helps us discern where the boundaries might be, there's still also a lot of gray area and regulatory ambiguity. And I think that's one of the key reasons it's important for companies to make sure that they have experienced legal counsel who are advising them on their marketing activities. There's also the potential for the substantiation standard to be changed through case law. And I think the Prevagen case is a good example of how that may happen. And so, Jack, do you want to talk a little bit about that case and perhaps what it may mean for industry and why it's important to pay attention to?
Sure. And I think you're quite right that the quote unquote substantiation standard is very nuanced, if you will. The FTC's guidance, which talks about the general phrase of competent and reliable scientific evidence, is difficult to understand, both for people in the industry that make these products and consumers. And to your point about trying to get some more clarity, the FTC, through a lot of its enforcement actions, has been trying to impose a de facto standard, at least in view of a lot of practitioners in this area, that tries to mimic the substantiation standards for drug claims, if you will, meaning that you want to have what we call an RCT, a randomized clinical placebo-controlled trial, and that is what you need, the gold standard to substantiate a claim that a dietary supplement might make with regard to what we call structure or function claim or some sort of health-related claim. And what's interesting about the Prevagen case is that in that matter, the company sponsored an RCT, and that wasn't enough for the FTC. The FTC argued that there were only a couple hundred people and the study was only 90 days, and that the manufacturer had cherry-picked certain results from the study. So I think the Prevagen case, and it's still being litigated, there are class actions that have spun out of it and all that. And so it's created a lot of uncertainty in the industry to feel that they're in a catch-22. They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. The FTC's hinted that what they really mean by substantiation is an RCT. And if you conduct an RCT, then they're going to criticize how you did your RCT and whether it was robust enough. And the reality of this is, as a practical matter, when you think of a drug, you could patent that because you're creating a synthetic molecule. So you can invest those type of monies into conducting an RCT or numerous trials that you need to go through the drug approval processes that Delia alluded to earlier. A dietary supplement, at least theoretically, is supposed to be something found in nature. And so you can't really patent the food. You might be able to patent the process by which you make food, but a raisin is a raisin, whether it's Sunkist or from ShopRite or whatever other brand it is, you can't patent it. And that's the dilemma for dietary supplement makers, is how much money can you invest in substantiating a scientific claim for a product that you can't patent and prevent your competition from thereby basically piggybacking on all the research you've done and all of the monies you've expended. It's a dilemma. Certainly, I think in the Prevagen case, one could, analyze the underlying study there. It was supposedly a memory improvement product and whether the study had its flaws. But I think the manufacturer has an important point that they made, and that, we invested the monies to conduct this study. And, in our view, that gave us an ample basis to make the claims we made. And we're not a drug, and you can't hold us to the same standard as you would a drug. This is going to be something I think that's going to be debated quite a bit going forward, particularly as the drug approval process, although we've seen it for the COVID vaccines suspended somewhat, it still is a formidable barrier to bringing products to the market. And more consumers, I think, are going to still seek dietary supplements for both their well-being and their health.
I think that's a great point, Jack. And I would just like to mention, I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one thing to keep in mind when thinking about the pathway to bringing a product to marketplace, whether it's pursuing the dietary supplement pathway or pursuing the drug approval pathway, which we talked about is very expensive, it's very costly, and it's risky, is that although the points you make about patent are well taken, there are regulatory exclusivities that are available under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that do incentivize companies to develop products as new drugs and actually afford them a period of market exclusivity when they do so in an innovative way. And so oftentimes when we're working with clients who are at the sort of initial crossroads, we're helping them think through how those regulatory exclusivities might apply if they pursue the drug approval pathway, or how they may not. That's a question I think every company should ask to avoid experiencing the pitfall that the Prevagen case illuminates exists, which is you invest the same amount of money that you could have essentially, or maybe at least a significant amount of money to do an RCT and develop data that would support a new drug application. And then you experience the same level of scrutiny by a regulator that FDA would apply in evaluating it. So why not in that case, just go all the way, right? These are the questions that companies need to ask themselves on a regular basis when they're thinking about how to best capitalize on the market and bring their products to market quickly and efficiently.
So we have the FDA's framework under DSHEA and the FTC, which is looking to make sure our claims are adequately substantiated and truthful and not misleading. And then we also have the FDA and FTC working together. And we've seen a lot of examples of this kind of coordination in the past year and a half, particularly with FDA and FTC issuing joint warning letters to companies marketing supplements claiming to prevent or treat COVID-19. And we've also seen joint enforcement efforts outside of the COVID-19 space. Recently, there were joint warning letters sent to 10 supplement companies for making illegal claims related to the treatment and prevention of diabetes, and also making product efficacy claims that were not adequately supported. Jack, do you think we'll continue to see these coordinated FDA, FTC enforcement efforts?
I think so. While there's certainly going to be some efforts, I think, to avoid overlap and duplication and conserve resources, I think what you're alluding to in the COVID context is somewhat unique in that the dietary supplement market is fragmented in the sense that you have different kinds of products that are marketed to different sorts of people. So one segment, for example, is the bodybuilding segment, if you will. There's all kinds of protein powders and pre-workout things, and all these things you drink that's supposed to make you look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you can break through buildings and all that sort of stuff. And I think that the government's attitude towards those products are like, that's a very unique consumer subset, and these are folks that really do their own homework and their own research, as opposed to what's been happening with COVID and some of the more wide-scale advertising that you're seeing addressed more to the general public. And some of it, even I'll say, is quite ridiculous. I mean, some of the warning letters that I've read that eating silver will cure COVID, I think you're better off just keeping silver as a coin. So some of the attitude of the regulators, I think, is that we need to do more to protect the general public from these sorts of improper disease claims about COVID and the diabetes. Again, that's going to be directed towards a very vulnerable population, typically elderly people. So I think you're going to see more of that. There's another interesting nuance to this, in my view, also related to COVID. We've been living with COVID for so long now. It's become part of the fabric of our lives almost, but it wasn't until March of 2020 when the World Health Organization declared that this was actually a pandemic. And what happened in response to that was, and understandably, a lot of federal regulators want to protect their own work staff. And so the FDA suspended inspections for quite a bit of 2020, and for no other reason that they were worried about the health and safety of their own staff. And similar with the FTC, their investigators pulled back. So what are they going to do? They're sitting around working remotely. So they went on the web and they're looking at everyone's ads on the web and their claims of efficacy on the web and the ads that are virtual and on Facebook. If you look at a lot of the recent warning letters, they are an outgrowth of this. And now I think this is going to be a permanent part of our regulatory landscape because agency sees, wow, we can have folks working from home at less cost and conduct investigations virtually. We don't have to do an inspection anymore. Not that they'll do away with that in their entirety. So I think you're going to see a lot more FDA/FTC, I'll call it virtual enforcement, if you will, where they're looking at people's websites, they're looking at people's ads on the interweb and on the internet, because that is where so much of advertising takes place nowadays. And they could churn out warning letters or enforcement actions without sending an investigator out into the field. To me, it's a very interesting development. And even as the hopefully COVID pandemic winds down, I think you're going to see that as a permanent part of the enforcement landscape.
Yeah, I agree, Jack. It definitely seems like a lot of the websites and the other virtual materials are definitely getting a hard look lately. And beyond promotion-related enforcement, which I expect will continue to be a mainstay in this space, Delia, can you speak to other areas in the supplement space that have garnered FDA concern?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I think one of the biggest tensions I see, I alluded to earlier, which is the tension between developing a product for therapeutic use or developing it to come to market as a dietary supplement, and weighing the pros and cons associated with each approach and making the right decision. And I think one issue that we've seen sort of emerge in this space, an issue created as a result of what's called the exclusionary clause, which is part of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and basically says that once an ingredient is subject to substantial clinical investigations that have been made public, in other words, an effective IND would be an example of that, the ingredient may not be marketed as an ingredient in a dietary supplement unless it was first marketed as such, or unless FDA promulgates a regulation permitting it to be so marketed. And we've seen this play out in the context of cannabidiol, which is an ingredient that may naturally be derived from cannabis. It's widely marketed in the dietary supplement space, but it's also an ingredient in an FDA-approved drug product. And for the first time, we saw FDA sort of entertain invoking this regulatory provision that allows it to create a regulation permitting the ingredient to be marketed in a dietary supplement, despite being subject to the exclusionary clause. But we've also seen like a real reluctance by FDA to sort of fully move forward with that regulatory scheme. And I think one of the issues that FDA is trying to balance appropriately is weighing its interest in fostering innovation with incentivizing companies to pursue the drug approval process, which FDA unquestionably wants companies to do. It really does provide FDA the best opportunity to rigorously evaluate an ingredient's safety and therapeutic value, but at the same time also create access to safe and affordable medications and safe products. The net outcome is that under the current scheme, most of the time, the FDA makes decisions, policy decisions that favor pharmaceutical companies versus dietary supplement manufacturers, but it's not always that cut and dry. And I think the genuine interest and work that FDA has done to potentially bring cannabidiol to market as a dietary supplement is an element of that balancing. In terms of whether FDA has the tools in place to regulate dietary supplements currently that are potentially unsafe, I tend to agree with Jack that it does. There are ample provisions in the FDCA that authorize FDA to take enforcement action against adulterated substances, against substances that are illicitly marketed because they fall within the definition of drugs. Another potential area that I think some may argue could require maybe more authority or more clarity is creating a pathway for dietary supplements to be marketed that include ingredients that are also in some form or another marketed as drugs, marketed as components of drugs. And I think there are many people that believe there should be a clearer pathway to that market than what we've seen FDA try to create with cannabidiol. And it might make the dietary supplement regulatory scheme more accessible and might create simply a better marketplace for consumers. But not everybody feels that way. And certainly, regardless of what position you take, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of pitfalls that you can fall into.
Yeah, and Jack, there's definitely real risk here for the industry and making sure they're complying with the applicable requirements. Can you speak to a little bit of the criminal enforcement considerations that industry should be taking into account as well?
We're looking at the criminal aspects of the whole dietary supplement world. I think the number one thing we see is the so-called spiking cases. All right, you're selling a dietary supplement product and you're spiking it with a pharmaceutical drug. We see a lot of this in what I call the sex market, where the dietary supplement manufacturer will be marketing some sort of herbal product to help with impotence, but it actually contains prescription generic sildenafil or some other similar Cialis or some other similar type pharmaceutical. You'll see this in some of the products directed toward the bodybuilding market, which is spiked with steroids. So those sort of things where we're not talking about the wholesomeness of the product, but that they contain illegal ingredients, that's certainly been an area for criminal prosecution. And another interesting area is a lot of the dietary supplements rely on imported ingredients, some of which come from countries that have unique climates that produce these dietary ingredients. And some of them actually are from sensitive species. So one example I can think of is a thing that was very popular. I think Oprah even talked about it, Hoodia, which was a weight loss ingredient, which came from a very rare South African plant, a cactus type plant. And supposedly, if you ate Hoodia, you would lose weight because all the Bushmen in South Africa were very skinny. So why can't you be too? But actually, what was happening was two things. One was the illegal importation of Hoodia, which was a regulated endangered plant, and the substitution of just plain old Arizona cactus for Hoodia. And so there were some criminal prosecutions regarding those sort of things, as well, where the content of the product is fraudulent in some way. Either something is illegally imported or is represented to contain something that it's not. I think, just to conclude, one trend that I would like to point out, which I think is a good thing, is that for sure, I think Delia has a good point that, we need the government regulators to be vigilant and what have you. But there's a good deal of self-enforcement that's going on that you're seeing right now where, one dietary supplement company, becomes aware that their competitor is selling a product that's falsely labeled or making claims that are outrageous, and they're trying to play by the rules, and they'll sue a competitor for making false misrepresentations about their product. They'll sue under the Lanham Act. They'll have other sort of private litigations. And that's having, I think, a deterrent effect on people going beyond the pale when it comes to the marketing of dietary supplements.
Before we wrap up today, I wanted to ask you both one kind of final looking forward question. We've seen some interesting trends in the last year and a half or so, fueled by COVID and otherwise. What do you see on the horizon for the rest of 2021 and going into 2022? What should industry be looking at? Delia, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think one thing that industry should continue to pay attention to, and that we'll continue to see in our practice, is meeting FDA's expectations under Part 111 for CGMP compliance. I think that will be an area where FDA continues to enforce, even though we've seen a reduction in inspections due to COVID-19. I mean, domestic inspections especially are more likely to occur than foreign inspections. And so the company should be prepared to be audited by FDA and have compliance policies and procedures and mechanisms in place. I think an area that everyone's going to continue to watch, as I alluded to earlier, is going to be what FDA does with respect to cannabidiol. I genuinely believe that some of the delay in progress on that issue is a result of COVID-19 and agency resources being devoted to other, understandably more important initiatives. But, we have a new administration, we have a new commissioner. It'll be interesting to see, where FDA goes, if anywhere, on cannabidiol this year.
So my concluding thought as to what's on the horizon, much of the dietary supplement space consists of companies that farm out a lot of the functions. So they'll use a contract manufacturer, they'll import a lot of the raw ingredients and what have you. And what some players in the industry don't understand is that they're still responsible for these things that Delia has referred to, these good manufacturing processes, all these things about making sure that the product and its ingredients are wholesome and produced in the proper way. And I expect that there's going to be some folks made examples of that they felt that they could just rely on whatever their contract manufacturer told them or whatever their supplier told them. And the industry needs to understand that. I think the agencies are going to get more vigorous in enforcing the responsibility for the product that you're putting your name on, that you're responsible for all these other entities that have contributed to your bringing that product to market. You have to make sure that it was produced in a GMP certified facility. You have to make sure that the foreign ingredient suppliers have been verified. You have to make sure that it was packaged and labeled properly. You don't farm out the responsibility for these things just because you had hired others to help you in bringing the product to market.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jack.
And thank you both so much for sharing your predictions. And Jack and Delia, really thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And also thank you to all of our listeners. Don't forget to subscribe to Diagnosing Health Care, which is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Health Care. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. The Employment Law This Week and Diagnosing Healthcare podcasts are presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.